Hello. In this tutorial we're going to create 3 melodic voices that use a shared ID of how their notes are generated. What they'll have in common is that they'll use 2 sources, one more random and the other more predictable, and combine them into one signal. The modules used for this will however differ between the voices. Together, these 3 voices will sound something like this. First, however, I'm going to add some utility modules to the patch. Since there will be 3 voices to connect, let's add in a mixer. We'll use the MixMasterJr from MindMeld for this. And since there will be a reverb effect used, I'll also use the AuxSpander module to the right of it. For the reverb, we'll use the Plateau module by Valley. Connect the input of Plateau to the first aux send of the mixer, and send the reverb output back into the input of the mixer. Since this is a send effect, we won't let the module play any of the incoming dry signal, and let it send out a full wet reverb signal. Open up the modulation depth a bit, and close down the highs and lows a bit on the input and the reverb filters. We also have to connect the mixer to the main audio output. This patch will need a clock, so let's add the clocked module from Impromptu. It can stay on 120 beats per minute. The notes for the voices will also have to be quantized to a scale. In this patch, that will be done by the Lazy Susan quantizer, which has multiple inputs that it can quantize. And over here, on these LEDs that look like a keyboard that has been turned 90 degrees, you can specify the scale to quantize to. I'll set this to a C minor pentatonic, so that's a C, an E flat, an F and a G, and a B flat. Let's move these modules to the top row, and now we're ready to build the first voice. As indicated in the intro, the note sequences in this patch will be generated by combining 2 input sources, one more random and the other more predictable or stable. For this first voice, the randomness will be provided by a sample and hold module from Bogaudio. Each time this module receives a trigger on the gate input, it will sample the current value on the signal input and hold that value on the output. And if there is nothing connected to the signal input, the module will instead use an internal noise generator. And the bottom part does the same as the top part. Let's trigger the module using the clocked output. Double the rate of that clock, and now there will be random values coming out of the sample and hold output. Let's visualize that using the count modular oscilloscope. Connect the first channel to the sample and hold output, slow down the oscilloscope, and now you can see that each time a trigger is received on the sample and hold, the output changes to a different random value. But this value is going from 0 to 10 volts, which in note values corresponds to 10 octaves, which is way too much, but we can change that of course. If you right click on the sample and hold module and go to normal range, it can be set to plus and minus 1 volt, which also shows on the oscilloscope now, as it jumps within that 1 volt range around the middle line. But since these are random values, they don't correspond to exact notes, so this will sound out of tune, which is where the Lazy Susan quantizer comes into play. Connect the sample and hold to the first CV input and send the CV output back into the oscilloscope. Now we have quantized random notes that move 1 octave above and below middle C. So let's play them. We'll use the VCO module from Bogaudio as oscillator. Connect the volt per octave input to the quantizer output, reduce the volume of the first channel on the mixer by 10 dB, and connect the triangle output of the VCO to the mixer, which will let us hear the random note sequence we've constructed. But since the VCO is constantly playing, we also hear the notes without gaps between them. To fix that, we'll add an AD module by Bogaudio, which generates envelopes that we can then use on a VCA from VCV to open and close the volume. Connect the AD envelope output to the VCA CV input, send the VCO output through the VCA, and now we need something here to trigger the AD module to generate envelopes, which is where the Lazy Susan's trigger output comes in handy. Each time the Lazy Susan detects a note change on the CV, it will send out a pulse signal on the corresponding trigger output, which is what we can use to open up our VCA. As we connect it to the AD module, you can hear the volume opening and closing. Let's set the attack a bit shorter to 0.1 and the decay to 0.5, which gives a bit of a snappier note. Now I want these notes to play 1 octave higher. This is something we can do by changing the frequency on the VCO. Right click it, and if we multiply the frequency by 2, the notes will be played exactly 1 octave higher. And that's the first part of our note sequence done, in that it is playing these randomly generated notes. Now to bring in the second part of the note sequence generation, we'll need to be able to combine this with another signal. For this we'll use the Offset module from Bogaudio. Send the output of the sample and hold to the offset input and connect that to the quantizer. Now we can move the random note sequence using this offset knob, moving them up and down. And there's also a CV input for this offset, so we can modulate it using another signal. For this, I'll add a 4FO module by Bogaudio. This module has an internal LFO that is sent to the 4 outputs using a different offset for each output. We'll quickly visualize this by connecting some of the outputs to the oscilloscope. And now you can see how there is the same sine signal being displayed with an offset on each of the outputs. Let's turn the 4FO into slow mode and change it from a sine into a triangle signal so that we get a nice straight moving signal. Disconnect the 4FO from the oscilloscope using shift click and use the first output as CV input for the offset module. And now if we set an offset of 2 volts on the module, this will cause the resulting notes to also start moving up and down. But because this input is constantly moving, the output of the offset module is now also constantly moving, which in turn will cause the quantizer to detect additional note changes and send those out on its outputs in between the triggers coming from the clock module. But we can use the second part of the sample and hold to fix that. Let the output of the offset module first go through the input of the bottom part of the sample and hold and connect the output back to the quantizer. And when there is no cable connected to the bottom gate of the sample and hold, it will instead use the gate of the top part to trigger the bottom part. So now this moving voltage is also sampled and held by the clock trigger, and the notes no longer change in between beats. But I think in the current combination of the 2 input signals, the randomness has a bit too much impact. I wanted to stick a little closer to the LFO signal. This is something that we can actually fix using the offset module. Using this scale knob, if we change that from 1 to 0.5, then the input signal from the sample and hold will be scaled down by half, and thus only having half as much impact on the end result, as the notes follow the LFO pattern more closely. Let's zoom in a bit to make that clearer. I think that right now this voice is a bit too dense. There are too many notes in there. Instead of just turning down the ratio on the clock module, I'm going to use another module to reduce the number of triggers and to bring some randomness into them. For this, I'll add a Bernoulli gate module. This module expects a trigger signal on its input and sends that trigger at random to either the A or B outputs. And then this probability knob specifies how often on average the signal is sent to either of the outputs. Turn the knob to the left and the A output gets more triggers. Turn it to the right and more of them go to B. We'll keep it at 50% here. Send the clocked output through the Bernoulli gate and connect the B output to the sample and hold. This results in less notes being played and some randomness in when they are played. Clean up the patch by moving these modules together, and that completes the note sequence of our first voice, combining randomness from the sample and hold with predictability from the LFO. As it is now, this voice sounds a bit bare however, so let's add some effects to it. The first obvious thing to do is to open up the reverb on the mixer for this voice. Open that up to -12 dB, and that immediately sounds a lot better. Next we'll add in a delay using the Chronoblob 2 module. Sync it with the same clock as the rest of the voice. And click this button once to change it to a ping pong delay, which means that any signal coming in on the right channel will first be repeated on the left, then on the right, the left, and so on. And same for the left channel, first to the right, and so on. So let's take the output of the voice and connect that to the input of the delay module. Hook up the outputs of the delay back to the mixer. Now the reason to use the right input is that if you were to only send something into the left input, the module will automatically duplicate that on the right input. And that would take away the ping pong effect, since right and left would be the same signal. Let's increase the delay duration by moving this knob until it is pointing towards this tree. We'll reduce the feedback to 50%, so that there are less repeats played. It will increase the dry-wet ratio to 75% so that those repeats become more pronounced. And with that, our first voice sounds a lot more interesting. For the second voice, we're going to change the source of the randomness. Instead of using a sample and hold module, I'll add a Turing machine my music thing Modular. Just like the sample and hold, this module expects a trigger signal to perform its operation. So we'll connect it to the second output of the clocked module. Each time the Turing machine receives a trigger, it will generate a new random value. But unlike the sample and hold, it doesn't store just one value, it stores a list of values. The length of the list is defined by this knob, which is currently set to 16. Let's change the list length to 8 instead, which is also represented by these LEDs at the top of the module, that change as the values of the list are changed. The randomness of the list is controlled by this big knob over here. When that is pointing upwards, the values will be completely random, and the resulting sequence on this output will also be completely random. But if you start moving this knob to the right, the module will start keeping more and more of the existing values in the list. And when the button is all the way on 1, whatever values are in here remain in here, and this sequence becomes fixed. So now let's use this sequence output as a note sequence. Connect it to the quantizer and send that into the oscilloscope. And now you can see the sequence that's being generated. But it goes from 0 volts to 5 volts, which is 5 octaves, and thus too big a range. But we can modify that using another offset module. Send the Turing machine output into the offset module and then onto the quantizer, so that we can reduce the range using the scale knob. I'm going to set that to 0.4 for now, because 5 volts times 0.4 equals 2 volts, so the output values are now in a 2 octave range. Let's also zoom in a bit on that signal. And now we can start playing those notes. For this voice, I'm going to use the Ts-L module by Instruo. Connect the volt per octave input to the quantizer output. Change the volume on the mixer to minus 15 dB. And connect the sine output of the Ts-L with the mixer. Let's mute the first voice for now. And speed up the clock for the Turing machine so that we can hear that 8-note sequence repeating. And now if we start turning down the big knob on the Turing machine, we'll start hearing some variation coming into that sequence. The further you turn it back, the more randomness gets introduced, until all the way at the 12 o'clock position you get a completely random sequence. I'm going to set this to 0.7 for a slowly evolving sequence. And just like in the other voice, I want to introduce some variation into this trigger. So we'll use the second half of the Bernoulli gates to half the number of triggers received with some randomness included. Now just like in the first voice, we'll want to break up the notes that are played by the Ts-L module, so we need an envelope generator. For this voice, we'll use the Instruo cnoc module. Connect its input to the trigger output of the Lazy Susan, and now we get a bipolar and a unipolar output at the top of the module. And this unipolar output is what we can use as an envelope. Unlike the first voice, I'm not going to use a VCA here to separate the notes, but I'll use a filter instead, the Instruo I-o47. If we connect the Ts-L output to one of the filter inputs, and then send the low pass output into the mixer, since the filter lets more or less high frequencies pass through when you close it all the way down and open it up again, you get a volume-like effect. So if we set it to all the way closed by default, we can cause it to open up for each note by connecting the generated envelope to the FM input and opening up the FM attenuator to 0.6 for example. Let's increase the attack time on the cnoc a bit to 0.5 and also increase the release to 0.7, which results in our desired separated notes. So now that we have the random part of our note sequence playing as a slowly evolving sequence, we can now add the LFO to create the up and down movements by connecting it to the offset. I'll use the opposite phase output for this, so that as one voice moves up, the other moves down. For the second voice, we're going to use a slightly smaller 1.5 voltage offset value, and also here, since the LFO is constantly moving, the offset output is also constantly moving, and thus changing the notes on the quantizer in between the beats that are coming out of the Bernoulli gate. So let's fix that with another sample and hold module. Let the signal pass through it before going to the quantizer. And triggering the sample and hold with the same gate signal. So now our notes also change on the beat again. I am going to reduce the impact of the Turing machine on the movement a bit, however, by changing the scale over here to 0.2. And that completes the note sequence generation for this voice. So let's shape its sound a bit now. First we'll add some reverb, set it to -12 dB, and we'll also add a delay here. For this voice, we'll use the Prince of Perception by Flag. Set its delay time to 1.5 seconds. Connect the filter output to the delay input. And send the delay output into the mixer. And change the mix to 0.5 to bring the delay sound out a bit more. But right now this voice sounds a bit muffled. It lacks some punch. To fix this, we can use one of the other outputs of the Ts-L. Let's take this wavefold output and connect it to the second input of the filter. And now if you open up the wavefold tab, you'll hear some punch coming in there. I'll set this to 0.75. And also change the symmetry bias a bit to -0.6. That should have been a minus, not a plus. And the wavefold also has a CV input, so we can introduce some variation into that. For this we can use the bottom part of the sample and hold module. Set the normal range to 0 to 3 volts. This trigger will also cause that update every time a new note is played, and we can now connect the output to the CV input, which will cause each note to sound different. Let's bring the first voice back into the mix again and listen to how that sounds. Right now, the second voice is a bit overpowering, which is due to the presence of the wavefolded signal, but we can change that on the I-o47 filter. If you move this gain slider down a bit towards the bottom input side, it will start using less of the top input and more of the bottom input signal. So now we hear more of the sine input and less of the wavefold one. And that completes our second voice. In the first voice we combined randomness from the sample and hold with predictability from an LFO. And in the second voice we replaced the randomness with a Turing machine. So in the third voice we're gonna keep the sample and hold randomness and replace the LFO instead. So let's first add in another sample and hold module. Set it to plus and minus 1 volt. Trigger it with the same clock output. Add in an offset module. Connect the sample and hold to it. Quantize the output. And send that onto the oscilloscope. Zoom it in a bit. Set the scale on the offset module to 0.5 and the offset to 2 volts. Now for the offset CV, we'll need something else. I'll use the Bogaudio Walk2 module for this. This module generates 2 randomly moving signals, which are represented by this green dot. As it moves left and right on the x-axis, the signal on the x output will move up and down. And as it moves up and down on the y-axis, the signal on the y output will also move up and down with it. And using these rate knobs, you can set a speed at which the dot moves. I'll set the x rate to 27%, which will increase the movement speed on the x-axis. And we'll use that output for the offset module. This is again a constantly changing value, causing the offset output to constantly change, and thus also causing the quantizer to move in between beats. So once more, let's send that signal to the sample and hold, before sending it to the quantizer, so that it only changes based on this trigger. To play the resulting note sequence, I'm going to use the Geodesics DarkEnergy module for this voice. Connect its volt per octave input to the quantizer. Reduce the volume on the third channel with 5 dB and connect the DarkEnergy to the mixer. I wanted to play the notes in a higher range, which we can do by setting this frequency offset to 1, which will cause it to play 1 octave higher. Now for this voice, we won't need an external VCA to separate the notes, because the DarkEnergy has one built in. Click this button over here, and now anytime the module detects a note change on the input, it will trigger an internal VCA, the length of which we can set on the knob over here. Let's set that to 600 milliseconds. Now once more, this voice is sounding a bit dense, so again I want to reduce the number of triggers for it. But instead of using another Bernoulli gate, which has 2 sections, I'm going to use a chances module by Count Modula, which does exactly the same, but only has 1 instance of that functionality. Send the trigger into the chances input and connect the B output to the sample and holds, which reduces the number of notes played by this voice. Now let's work on the sound a bit. The DarkEnergy module has two internal oscillators that work together, the left one and the right one. Each of them can self-modulate and cross-modulate each other. Let's add some cross-modulation to both of them, a value of 0.06 for both. And also apply some self-modulation, 0.11 for the left and 0.2 for the right. And you can hear that influencing the sound. You can also set the oscillators into LFO mode. If you press this button twice until the yellow light turns on, this side is now in LFO mode. Let's slow it down a bit more to -2. And now this side will slowly cross-modulate the left oscillator over time. But there's also these two CV inputs that we can use to modulate the sound even more. Let's use the two outputs of the Walk2 module for this. Press this button until the LEDs above and below it light up, which defines how the input CV influences the sound. And now we can apply some cross-modulation CV. Let's use -0.06 and some self-modulation CV of 0.08. So now the sound changes even more over time. Let's also add some reverb on this voice. And we'll also give it a delay. For this voice, we'll use the Tap Dancer by Flag. Reduce the tempo down to 60 BPM. Move the rate and the depth of the modulation all the way down. And we'll set the DarkEnergy through the delay and the delay onto the mixer. Let's reduce the ducking on the main delay and on the feedback to 0.25 so that the delay signal doesn't get muted too much. And then we'll increase the mix to 0.75 to bring out the delay signal a bit more. There is still one thing I want to change, and that is the padding of the voices. On the first voice, due to the ping pong effect of the delay, you see some movement going on between the left and right channel, but the other voices are more straight to the middle. So let's use the padding on the mixer to change that. And since we have two more unused LFO outputs on the 4FO module, each being in an opposite phase, they are perfect modulation sources to move the voices from left to right, which you can see by the yellow lines that start moving on the mixer. But I want the effect to be a little more subtle, so if we right-click in the title at the top of this channel, we can change the amount that the input signal affects the panning. I'll move this down to 60% and do the same on the third channel. And now these two voices are constantly moving to opposite sides in the mix. And with that, the patch is now complete. 3 voices, all combining 2 input sources into a note sequence. I actually created this patch as an idea for a tutorial 8 months ago, but didn't do anything further with it back then since I thought it was a bit too big and then forgot about it. But when I rediscovered it recently while doing some cleanup in my working folder, I thought it sounded pretty good. So I used it as a starting point for a complete ambient patch, which resulted in my recently released PTW-SLY patch, which actually stands for Patch That Was Started Last Year. In that patch, these 3 voices form the background chatter on top of which the other melodic voices can play. So if you want to hear one way in which these voices can be used, I invite you to go and have a listen to that patch. And then afterwards you can go and experiment with what we built here to see where it brings you. And as always, thank you for watching and happy patching.